Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming. My name is Greg Sly. I'm the Assistant Director of Library and Archives here at the York County History Center. Just a few announcements to get us started this evening. This program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later. If you would like to receive our e-newsletter and you're not signed up, there's a sign-up sheet on the table to my left. And on June 19th, the History Center will offer a Civil War walking tour. On June 26th, YCWRT will preview the documentary After Ike. It's a documentary about the longest motorized military convoy assembled by humankind. On July 1st, there will be a members and donors only preview reception for our new exhibit, Revolutionary York. On July 3rd, in the evening, there'll be a public opening of the exhibit as part of the First Friday program. And on July 4th, the History Center Museum will be open for normal hours from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And please be sure to check out our website for more information on these programs, particularly with the July 4th weekend. There's a lot happening, so be sure to check out the website for hours, costs, signups, all that sort of thing. And our website is yorkhistorycenter.org. And now I'll invite up Scott.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's York Civil War Roundtable. Just want to thank everyone who's come here, and we do have a large crowd tonight. Glad to see that. Just a reminder for those who are attending that we do take off for July and August for our summer break, but we will return in September as we learn about the 130th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, York County in the Civil War. The author, Terrence Belts, is a great grandson of the 130th Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry soldier. He'll take us on a journey following in the footsteps of the regiment's men, their voices which are historically recorded in their personal diaries, letters, and memoirs. This often overlooked regiment endured Antietam's Bloody Lane, Fredericksburg's Stone Wall, and held the Union line during the Battle of Chancellorsville. Terrence will look at, he'll conclude with post-war biographical information about many of the soldiers. Terrence was born in Canton, Ohio, resident of Earlysville, Virginia, completed his Bachelor of Science in Business Administration at Bowling Green State University in 1972, Master of Arts in History at the University of Richmond in 2004. He retired from the Virginia Housing Development Authority in Richmond and is a retired U.S. Army colonel with an ardent interest in 19th century American history, particularly the Civil War. He is the paternal great-grandson of Private William H. Seifert, who served in Company C of the regiment. He's a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, Sons of Union Veterans, and in his spare time, he works on family genealogy and is a volunteer with Find a Grave. He's married to Patricia Belts, and together they have 2 daughters. Tonight, we're going to fittingly look back at the American Revolution and the Civil War and how they cross over and interact with one another as we get ready to celebrate the semi-quincentennial of our nation. We're going to be looking at how York County was involved in both of those wars. And to do that, we're going to welcome Jim McClure, who is a retired editor of the York Daily Record. And he served in leadership positions at the news organization for more than 30 years. He's the author or co-author of 10 books on York County history, including works on the American Revolution, Civil War, World War II. In 2025, he was inducted into the Pennsylvania News Media Association Hall of Fame. He's a partner with Jamie Norpel and Dominish Miller, and the streaming YouTube series, Hometown History. And before we welcome Jim up, the Civil War Roundtable also has a sign up here if you want to receive our newsletters that I send monthly before our programs, so you'll know about our upcoming programs. And also, we will be passing a basket that does help pay for our speakers that come and present to us. But now, let's welcome Jim McClure as he presents part 2 of the series that he started last year of how the American Revolution intersected with the Civil War in York and Adams County.
It's really great to be here, and this is part 2. So I think if you want to see part 1, I know it's on the History Center YouTube channel. I know you'll be stimulated by this tonight, and you want to go. Anyway, if you didn't see it, this is started. They're both standalone, so don't worry about that. I am going to kind of do a merged program for the York College Lifelong Learning Institute. This summer on parts 1 and 2. That's in July 23rd. So, Bob, I'm giving you a fair warning that you've seen at least part of it already. True. So, it's great to be here. This is a prestigious opportunity to speak, and I really appreciate being asked to come back virtually every year. And I just want to give credit. I've talked to Cody Esch from the Seminary Ridge Museum, and we went over some of these ideas, and because he's really good at this stuff. And so, I want to give him credit. And 1 or 2 places I'll probably point that out. And the way I like to do it is if you have questions as we go, just raise your hand or just yell it out. Okay, because I'd like to get the questions. If I misspeak, Scott Mangus will correct me, for example. I know, and he should. And but no, if you have any, if you have a question as we go, we'll have questions at the end. But I'm glad to take questions as we go, and I'll try to manage the time. So we're not here till 9 o'clock tonight. We won't be here till 9 o'clock tonight, no matter what. Let's see. So anyway, we're going to start off. This is American 250 year, so this is appropriate as Scott said. And the Revolution, the History Center is having the Revolution York exhibit. It's going to be in this room right over here. Never before seen room. It's being put together even this week, and it'll be opening on July 1st. So if you want to see, a new exhibit on the American Revolution in York County, you'll see it on July 1st. And meanwhile, there's an installation, outdoor installation on the Arts of Confederation right outside the door here, across where we parked, some of us parked. So you'll be able to see that at your leisure as well. I'm kind of interested. I haven't seen it lit up at night. So if we get out of here at 9:30, like I hope it may be lit up when we leave here tonight. I haven't seen it lit up, so that'll be fun. This is one of these talks, and I don't know if you all did this when you were in school, high school, and college, and these compare and contrast types of talks. They're sometimes a little tedious. They're tedious to write, and then because you have to go back and forth, and so I'll try to make it not tedious. But I want to point out we'll be bouncing from the American Revolution to the Civil War and back. So just be ready for that. So we're going to talk about some 2020's anniversary projects. I like to do it all my talks, and we'll do a primer on the American Revolution because I think many of you here probably are more versed in the Civil War than the American Revolution. I could be wrong about that, but this is a Civil War roundtable. So we'll talk, and then we'll talk for most of the time about the intersection of the American Revolution and the Civil War, and then we'll do questions unless you have some as we go. So here are some takeaways for tonight, and you would be hard pressed to find anything north of the Mason-Dixon line as more of a underground railroad, Revolutionary War history and Civil War history than York County. Philadelphia for sure. There might be other places, and this is where you might be jumping in and saying, "What about?" But it is pretty unusual, and our geography has a lot to do with that. We'll be talking about that tonight. This is a chance on the Civil War discussions have kind of overtaken the American Revolution discussions in York County. A lot of the research in York County is now devoted to the Civil War. I mean, Scott Mingus's Tsunami of Books is a prime example of that. And so it's a good thing because we were playing catch up on the Civil War, and now we're catching up. But the American Revolution, there's not so much work being done on that. And so this is a chance for us to get back in the American Revolution. I think it's important if we're Civil War students, we would be interested also. can understand that better if we understand the American Revolution. So I think that probably many of us learned about the American Revolution in high school, and maybe we haven't read as much about it recently. And so this is a chance to catch up and maybe understand the Civil War a lot better. Okay, this is just a lineup. I'd like to show this, and you know, it keeps building. You go down the bottom here. Well, first, the History Center Museum went on board in 2024. The Revolutionary War exhibits coming up that we talked about there. But you go on down, these are all projects in the 2020s. And we can talk about why was it COVID, what was it that inspired these, you know, we can talk about that. Because COVID, we had a lot of people had a lot of time on their hands to think and direct grants and so on. But you can see what's happening in the 2020s. We have the Horn Farm rebuild after the fire earlier this decade. They have reopened. For example, the Hard Bargains installation is the installation out there in the Arkansas Federation. And camp security digs are now open to the public, meaning you can go out there and see where the digging is. And they're on June 20th, there's a dig an opportunity to go out and see camp security, unless it's already been sold out, I'm not sure. But they open that up fairly often, or they're opening it up more and more often to be able to see. They found where the stockade was for camp security. They found the post holes, and now they're finding how extensive the post holes are. So we'll be able to, I think if you go out there, you'll see some of the post holes. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Has anybody been out yet recently to the camp security site? They had an open house on June 13th, and now they're having another one on June 20th. So, and Ruins Hall it hasn't had its remake yet, but they had a big crowd down there for the Glen Rock Festival and so on. So that's a pretty impressive list, isn't it? You know, this is all history and culture stuff. The Chris Zack's museum just opened a couple months ago. You know, pretty impressive list. Okay, so you know, we'll some preliminary stuff here. This is American 250. This is kind of interesting the way our history works here. Is that it's about 85 years between the American Revolution and Civil War, and 85 years Civil War, World War II, and about 85 years from the World War II and to York County to where we are today. 85 is 250 roughly. You know, if you round it off. So that's kind of where we are. We have a young history as a country, don't we? We are still making mistakes because we're so young. We're just teenagers compared to some, and so we're making mistakes. We're still trying to figure things out, and so you know, and this is a couple of examples of that. You probably saw in the news this brother, you know, William Poole was the last. I don't know what real son means, but the last real son of a Civil War veteran just died. So you have someone that was a son of a Civil War veteran just died, you know, in the last 2 weeks. And then this Doc Heisen from Redline, this is a fascinating story. In medical school, he treated a drummer boy from the American Revolution. This was right after the Civil War. And then Doc Heisen died in 1931, Redline doctor, died in 1931. So he delivered, and could be mathematically possible, he delivered people that are alive today. You know, anybody here delivered by Doc Heisen? Well, you're too young. But anyway, and he practiced up till 1931, till about his death. And I don't know if he was delivering babies at that point. But anyway, I've talked to audiences before where someone said, yeah, Doc Heisen delivered me. That was a couple of years ago. So think about that. Someone had treated a Revolutionary War drummer boy. There's people alive, potentially alive today, that he delivered, brought into the world. So our history is young. A long way of saying our history is young. You ever think about that? Yeah. What's the implication of that? You know, that we have young. I kind of telegraphed some of it. We're still figuring things out, but you know, it's pretty amazing how young our history is. I always use this. I think this is helpful to me, if not to you. I think Bob's seen this a few times. You know, so we're talking, this is the outline of the American Revolution, a little primer on the American Revolution. We're talking here, and you know, and this is the area we're talking about, the 250th now, the Declaration of Independence. The first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. The shot that they call the shots heard around the world. You know, that's not to be confused with Scott, you're a baseball fan. What's the baseball analogy? Bobby Thompson, 1951, off of Ralph Branca. Yeah, the New York Giants. That Bobby Thompson in the World Series hit a decisive shot off of Dodgers. Ralph Branca called the shot that heard around the world. We're talking about the first one, and you know, and so that was in 1776, and then we jump ahead about 16 months, and this is when York came into the Congress came into York, chased out Philadelphia. We're not going to go into detail on that tonight, but they came here, and always I like to use that they kind of struggled here to York. They were kicked out of Philadelphia. They came here and they spent 9 months here. And some people say, well, kind of the biggest thing that they did here was the Federation, our first constitution, and it was a big deal. But you know, the Articles of Federation with the victory at Saratoga really combined to do what? To bring France on board. That was the biggest deal. So if you see stuff around where, you know, the Articles of Federation is a big deal, it is, because we have a whole exhibit out here. But we couldn't win the war without France. France was important, crucial to winning the war. And it took these two things to get them on board. We needed the Constitution and we needed a victory in a battlefield up in Saratoga, New York. We got both of them. This was the Valley Forge winter, this 9-month period when Congress was here. And then after that, we strutted back to Philadelphia. I'll give it a slide in the end to show how we strutted. And you know, it didn't show us strutting, but it gives an idea. We were pretty confident at that point because then we had the Battle of Monmouth, which was a draw. And then, but from that point on, we were kind of in command of the war. Meaning America was in command of the war. France came on board about right here. And meaning the ships showed up in this area. So, you know, this is a good place to start the story. This was on June 7, 1776. Somebody read in the paper today about Thomas Jefferson, you know, slept in York, in Hanover. He was on his way to Congress, got a haircut in Hanover, came through York and stayed in Lancaster. He was on his way to draft the Declaration of Independence. He was the primary drafter of that. And Richard Henry Lee, this was what got him going on the project. Richard Henry Lee, a Virginian, said, hey, we need 3 things. This is 1776, a year after the shot heard around the world. We were fighting, and so we needed 3 things. We needed a Declaration of Independence. We need to form foreign alliances, meaning France, and then we need a plan for Confederation, meaning the Articles of Confederation or Constitution. We needed those 3 things. So, you know, we did what all good Americans do. We formed committees, and there's 3 committees, and Thomas Jefferson headed this committee, and then John Dickinson, who was a statesman, served on this committee and drafted the Articles of Confederation. So, you know, it's committee work, good committee work that got us where we are today. It got us our independence. Okay, is this a little bit too much like high school or something? I just thought we want to talk about this a little bit and make sure we're starting in the same place here. So anyway, so he got these 3 things in motion, Richard Henry Lee, and as we know, on July 4th, 1776, 250 years ago, this document came out right here, the Declaration of Independence. And I talk about this because, yes, sir.
Was that Dickinson the same Dickinson local?
Yes. Yeah. John Dickinson, interestingly, didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, did all this other work, but he felt like we shouldn't withdraw from Britain this quickly. We ought to negotiate more. So interestingly, he did all this work with the Confederation and he got France on board, helped get France, but he didn't sign the Declaration. So we kind of lost the history in a way. So here we have, you know, this went out first, and in all cases in those days, and even today, you had a printed document that went out first, you know, because then you print 300 of them and you send them out and so on. That's exactly what happened. And this document came, not this document, this is the document, you can't even see it today because it's so faded, but this is a facsimile of it. And this handwritten thing came out in January 1777. 1777. So the signers weren't known until you know, about 6 months after this document came out. And this is the same thing with the Articles of Confederation 16 months later. You know, we had the articles that came out. It came out in written form. came out from New York. It was printed in Lancaster. This suggests that it was printed in York. This is a mural in York, but it was printed in Lancaster. We didn't have a press at that point. It came in December. Yes, sir.
I don't wanna pause anything. Why are we a federation and a confederation? What is the difference between a federation and a confederation?
You know, I don't
I don't
know.
mean to derail you.
Yeah, no, that's good. I never thought about that. A federation kind of implies that you're together, right? It means a centralized thing, and then confederation seems redundant, doesn't it?
Okay,
never
yeah,
thought
I
about
didn't know if you knew that. Okay.
No, but that's, they talk both ways. We need a federation, we need a confederation. It may be confederation, is a stronger word. Federation might just mean a centralized thing. Confederation means we have 13 states that came together. And, but that's good. I'll have to look that
Okay.
up. Yeah, thank you. So this was just wrong here. Oops. If you get questions, you won't throw me off. That's my own finger tip. This is on the side of the Elks and implies it was here in New York, but and I always like to say the newspaper sponsored this mural, and the last mistake the newspaper ever made. That's back in 1777. So anyway, so this went out, and then this. Some people say, well, the Artists Confederation were written in New York. Well, they weren't written in New York. They were actually already written. When we got here, they were crafted. They were edited in New York. They were added to, but they were really written before they got here in New York. And this beautiful document here wasn't signed. Some people say, well, the articles were signed in New York. They weren't signed here. They're signed in Philadelphia. They actually had the document in place. It was already ready, and then someone found typos and so on. So they said, oh, they've got to do it again. And they did it in Philadelphia. Okay, so this is the apex of the whole thing, and the federal government says drafting. It's not right. It's on a stamp, and that's the last mistake the federal government ever made too. And but you can see, there's a stamp that celebrates the French Alliance, which is a big deal. Okay, now we're starting this compare and contrast stuff. This is why you came tonight, and so this is one of the things. Some people like to slam the Arts Confederation, and it was a weak document. It was a states' rights document. It was kind of neutered early in the process, and the states had the power. And but it doesn't mean it was ineffective, because we prosecuted the war under this first Constitution, Articles of Confederation. But this is one of the things that came out of the Articles of Confederation was we brought the Big Ten schools on board. Boy, if we didn't have them, think how football would be, But these states came over as part of the Northwest Ordinance, or they were their territories. They became states. Imagine what the Civil War position would have been if we wouldn't have had these states, the Iron Brigade and so on, come on board. And these were most importantly, these were free states. They weren't slave states. And so this happened under the Articles of Federation. These came aboard as territories and later became states. So it came under this document that the Articles of Federation that became the American Revolution. And imagine the Underground Railroad, if these had been slave states up here, how the Underground Railroad would have operated. It wouldn't have, because you had to go into these slave states, and they probably wouldn't have, freedom seekers probably wouldn't have gone that way. They probably would have gone over here, wherever we started having gradual abolition in 1780. So we'll talk about that in a second. So here's just another kind of thing about the Articles of Confederation. There's a lot of words up here, but I'll just say that, in about the 1820s, there was a series of freedom suits, maybe even before that, where they used the Articles of Confederation. The freedom seekers who wanted full citizenship, Black people that were free people who wanted full citizenship, then they had the opportunity. They used the Articles of Confederation, because this is really brilliant on some lawyers' part that on behalf of these Black people who were looking to gain their full citizenship. The Articles of Confederation says that to better secure and perpetuate the mutual friendship and so on among the people of the different states of the Union, the free inhabitants, that's all free inhabitants, black and white, doesn't say just the white free inhabitants. Each of these states, and this lists them, paupers, vagabonds, fugitives from justice, accepted, shall be entitled to the privileges and immunities of free citizens. So it doesn't say, free blacks here. So the free blacks said, wait a minute, here we have this constitution for 12 years or whatever it was, and it said that we're entitled to all the privileges. Well, come on, fork it over. And so that was a document. They used this constitution, which is surpassed by the US Constitution, I should have said, in 1789. So, yes, sir.
Jim, before we leave the Revolutionary War,
Yeah.
because the Civil War, I think, dovetails into this question, I think.
Yeah.
And that is who influenced France to help us? Did they
Yeah.
hate Britain? Or did Ben Franklin just know how to eat French food very well over there? and
Yeah.
Convince them to do otherwise? Then I know in the Civil War, the French come through again.
Yeah, it was a number of things as always. It was good diplomacy on Ben Franklin's part. It was the fact that France hated Britain forever and they saw that Britain was weak. Britain at that time was a world, the sun wouldn't set on the British Empire. It was huge. Here we were, these scrappy colonists were fighting over here. France said, wait a minute, we have a chance to, put a chink in England's, for Britain's armor. And so that was a big part of it. France was no small country. It was the most powerful country in Europe. So France said, well, we'll come on board. So it was a combination of several things that caused France to do it. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So here's something, this couple surprises here maybe. Some people think, well, Quakers didn't fight in the American Revolution. They wouldn't have fought there because they were pacifist. And that's true, some were. But here we have in our own county, we have some Warrington Township, Wellsville Elementary students who researched the lives of these Revolutionary War soldiers who were buried in the cemetery up in Warrington Township, Quaker Meeting House Cemetery. So were all those Quakers? I don't know, but some of those seem like Quaker names. The Walkers, the Underwood, the Cooks, and so on. So, they're buried in, so that's a little surprising, maybe to some. It really, even the Moravians, other pacifists in the county, in the American Revolution and in the Civil War, it wasn't unified. They might have been pacifists, but they had some members that broke rank. We'll talk about that in a little bit later too. And then in just in Lebanon Cemetery alone, we have at least 30 Black veterans from the Civil War. It might make sense that'd be the case because that cemetery went up in 1872. And so, if you're a Black veteran, where would you be buried? You'd probably be buried in that cemetery. And that's exactly what happened. That's 30 known graves that are up there.
What is significant about that cemetery?
Oh, it's a historically Black cemetery. It's the first, it's kind of the prototypical, the question was, what's significant about the Lebanon Cemetery? Is it up to that point, there might have been Black sections in white cemeteries. They may have been buried elsewhere, but there wasn't a designated Black cemetery. Some of the Black community were put into the city cemetery or Potter's Field, which has gotten some publicity recently. But there wasn't a York area Black cemetery. There were Black cemeteries down in the southeastern area, but there weren't Black cemeteries here until 1872. So this is a chance. They wouldn't, in many cases, they wouldn't have been able to be buried. Black people would have been buried in white cemeteries, like Prospect Hill, for example.
Right.
Yeah. So here's some numbers here that we'll go over, and we'll talk about the Civil War first. These are Dennis Brandt's numbers. I think these are fairly up to date, Scott. This is pretty close. In the Civil War, 5,300 served, 510 died, and 637 were wounded. Probably more wounded, but this is what Dennis Brandt, who's done a database on these, was able to figure out. He doesn't put anything in there he doesn't know. So these are good numbers here. And then in the American Revolution, there's more than 4,000 served. That number we came across when we, as part of the Revolutionary War exhibit, some of us working on it, we compared about 3 or 4 different sources and came up with more than 4,000 served. Now think about that for a second. There's about 29,000 residents of York County in 1783. So half of those were women. So that gets us down to about let's say 14,000. Okay, and then half of those folks were boys or age people, not military age, so probably about half. So we had 4,000 out of about 7,000 that served in the American Revolution. That might suggest that we were patriotic around here, patriots around here versus loyalists around here. So those are rough numbers, but they're probably pretty close. That more than half the people here, way more than half served in the American Revolution of military age. This, if you notice right here, this is a Lewis Miller print here. You see this guy here, we're gonna talk about both these guys in a second, but you can see here, we're gonna zoom in on them here. These are the folks, we don't talk about these folks as much. These are the folks that came back wounded, and we don't, in most wars, we don't talk about that, or they go about their lives, or it's not, we talk more about those that died on Memorial Day and so on. So here we have, Jacob Barnes is the guy we just saw with the two canes. He was shot in both legs at Fort Washington in New York in 1776. He was detained for 15 months with those damaged legs. He returned to York and was in pain up into the 1800s. And then finally a surgeon removed one of his legs, and they had a musket ball in his deal. So he kept the musket ball. It's kind of proud, the stories say he's kind of proud of having a British musket ball that was in his leg. Now he had it in his hand. And so there's one good example of that. And here's another guy. This is a Medal of Honor winner. I think we had 2 Medal of Honor winners in the Civil War from York County. This was Denning. He was a Marine, and he's buried in Prospect Hill Cemetery. And basically, you can read that, but he was a hero in the South. He came back here, and he just kind of went, he wasn't right. And June Lloyd, who has looked into him, thinks he might have had PTSD. And he got into writing, and he wrote these nasty things about people in town, got into libel suits and so on. And I just was reading that he died and was in a shed somewhere, and someone happened to be walking by and looked in the shed and saw him dead. He died. Here we have this hero who died alone in a shed. So I don't, Scott, you may know, but I don't think there's been scholarly work on him. Looking at what he wrote and so on, and I'm not aware. I mean, there's been some work on him, but not. They have a ceremony in the Marine League every year, and Prospect Hill has a ceremony to honor him. It's largely forgotten otherwise, but there's a case. In both these cases, we had folks that came back from the war, and they just weren't. They were physically or mentally off. Okay, black veterans in both wars. Let's talk about this for a second. In the American Revolution, you get various numbers. There's 5,000 to 9,000 veterans in the Patriot military units, and about 20,000 in the British military units. British military units, the number's higher because they said, oh, if you come in and serve with us, or if you come through our lines, if you're enslaved and come through our lines, you can have freedom. So if you're in the South or in Virginia and say, oh, I can gain my freedom just by walking through the lines, then, so some of them went, and you can see more than double served with the British Army. They're mostly formerly enslaved people. Is that new to anybody, that there's that many Revolutionary War soldiers of people of color? That was new to me until about a couple of years ago. Yes?
There's a documentary on Netflix right now. I think it's Black Patriots. I just watched yesterday that has a long segment about the black loyalists.
Yeah.
And the Rhode Island.
Yes. It's interesting that in both these cases, Civil War, that they're the most popular, the best known units were in the North. And that was because the climate was better to raise black military units in the North, certainly not in the South. And but Pennsylvania did okay. We'll talk about that. We gradually manumitted slaves after 1780. And they were served under white officers. And then in the Civil War, we're familiar with all these stories. And there is a kind of a saying out there among lost cause people that there were black units raised in the Confederate Army, but that is not true. That kind of goes around. You can find literature on that, but most scholars say that's not true. This picture here, Scott Mingus is going to discover who this gentleman is here someday. This gentleman here what fought in the trenches at Wrightsville against the Confederate onslaught. He was beheaded by a cannonball. He was digging, then he started fighting, beheaded. And he came over from Columbia before that and started working. He's part of a unit, and we don't know his identity. And in 2013, there was this marker erected on Mount Pisgah Cemetery in his honor. Scott, do you think we're going to discover who he is? You don't think we will? Scott Mingus is, you know,
my best shot.
if Scott Mingus gave it his best shot, there is a lot of work being done on this with the Mifflin House project out in Helen Township. They're digging into a lot of this, and even in Columbia, there's a new underground railroad museum going up and so on. So a lot of people are looking at river history. So, you know, we'll see what happens there. I'm going to pause for a second. Questions, comments? You still with me? Yes, sir.
Well, you said about the 20,000 in the
Yes.
British units. Those were promised their freedom if they came from some slaveholders that were rebels, right? Not slaveholders that were loyalists. Am I
I
right?
think that is right. That's an interesting distinction. Where did these, you know, where did Lord Dunmore, gave this proclamation or said that if you come over, you can gain your freedom. But I'm not sure about that. It would seem to be the case that it would be rebels. But there was you can see that there was large numbers came over. After they came over, they weren't treated as well as they thought they would be. And, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I was reading some big fat book about gay
Yeah.
friendship, and I'm about, that far
Yeah.
through it. And that was in that book.
It makes sense that they
Well,
would.
and I think I was down in Williamsburg too, just a couple weeks ago.
Williamsburg.
I think I've probably seen it down there too.
Yeah, a lot of this came in Virginia here, and it makes sense that they wouldn't take enslaved people from loyalists because they wanted to keep them loyal. And but there's a lot of rebels, in Virginia with Thomas Patriots and Virginia with Thomas Jefferson and the like. So thank you. That's a good distinction. Okay.
Jim, were they segregated units?
They would have, yes, they were, although there are some accounts where you could find them were fighting under white officers and other units. But in the main, they started off as segregated units, yes. In the British Army, I'm not so sure, I should say that, I think so, but in the American Army, Continental Army, they were definitely segregated units, just like in the Civil War. Just like in World War II, right? In the Korean War, I guess was the first time we had integrated units. So both wars produced heroes, and here's a couple of the heroes here. Henry Miller, we'll talk about him in a second. He was he was a leader of the York Rifles. He wasn't the first leader. The first leader was Michael Doodle. So Michael Doodle went to town, and he went to Boston. He was head of the York Rifles, the York County Rifle Company that marched to Boston in 1775. And they marched there in about 24 days. So 24 divided by 400 and about 17 miles a day or so. They made it up there. So he later became head of that. They were a rifle company, snipers, marksmen, and you can see that they're shooting a barn here, to show their marksmanship here. There's a monument that celebrates both these, the York Rifles of the Civil War. York Rifles were early responders. They guarded bridges down in northern Maryland. Many became part of the 87th Regiment. So this is George Hay who headed that unit. So these are two heroes, emergent heroes. We think about them today, remember them today. Both wars produced leaders with different impacts. And here's Henry Miller. He later became the chief burgess of York in 1787 when York became a borough. So he was probably a Federalist, and he moved from there. Interestingly, he grew up in Millersville area, Henry Miller from Millerville, and he later left the area and went to Perry County. You don't often think about these founders of York County moving around. This guy did, and he was chief burgess and moved on later, and he was well respected in town. And then we have David Small, the chief burgess during the Civil War. What do we know about David Small, the chief burgess in the Civil War? Yeah, he was kind of the political leader of the county. He was a copperhead which was a peace Democrat. They were looking for negotiated peace. They weren't looking to win the war or fight the war anymore. We'll talk about that in just a second. But he was kind of the political leader. He owned the paper and he was Chief Burgess both. So he got a lot of clout. And he was part of the delegation that surrendered the town.
So was George Hay.
Yeah, George Hay probably brought, good, Scott Mingus said, George Hay, they brought a delegation of Republicans and Democrats out there to the farmhouse after A.B. Parker had catalyzed the surrender of the town. So there's a kind of formalized document at that point. Women were under pressure. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Women were under pressure in both wars, and you could take this, do a whole program on this. But we had this Frederica von Riedhazel. Her husband was one of the commanding generals of Saratoga. And so he was on parole, so he could move around the United States. And she was coming up from, I think, Baltimore to join him. And she was traveling to New York. She had 3 young children, and a tree fell in a thunderstorm, pinning the carriage. One of her child asked, "Hey, hitch from the front and pull it from the back and get out from under this tree." And they did, and they ended up meeting the husband in New York. But imagine that, being in this strange country, German being this strange country with 3 children, just riding along in a thunderstorm to meet your husband. Now in the British Army, they could, the families often joined the British officers, and they were part of the family life. If you're a military man in Britain, then your family could join you, and many of them had a family with them. Okay. Ellen Rowland is a famous example from Emmonsville, where there's a group of 20 rebels told her she was safer. She was out walking and trying to get to Emmonsville, and a group of 20 rebels who were in town in 1863 and during the Confederate invasion of York County, they asked, "Where's your husband? Why are you leaving home? You're better off if you stay in your home. They arms after burn your home." So they let her walk through rebel lines. But imagine that with your children walking through the woods and have 20 of these rough-looking rebels come up to you and talk about burning your home and so on. So both those cases gives just a glimpse about what life was like. So we have two courthouses played a role in wartime. We have Lewis Miller's rendering of the Colonial Courthouse in the center square in York. And often it's confused here, and this is the York County History Center. The bell tower, the big tall tower that you see in a lot of the drawings and paintings, was put up in 1815. This is how the courthouse looked. And the replica courthouse over here is following that original design here. So, the courthouse where the Continental Congress met in 1777, 1778. And then in the Civil War, this was the courthouse. This courthouse right here was built in 1839. It's where this courthouse is today. They built over this courthouse here. They tore it down partially and put this courthouse, and built this courthouse around the turn of the 20th century here. So this is where Juba Early, had his headquarters whenever the Confederates invaded in 1863. And there's a story, I'll get to you in a second, John. And there's a story here about Juba Early and Judge Fisher. And Juba asked him, "Do you have any contraband?" And Judge said, "Just some New York County cigars." And Early said, was aware that Pennsylvania cigars were not that good. So Juba Early said, "No, I think we will not rob you of them." But he robbed York of, tried to get $100,000 out of York, and and did get a lot of other types of things, good food and uniforms and so on, from York, uniform cloth and so on. So anyway, that's where Early was, in this building right here. Yeah, John.
Go back to the Louis Miller picture of the original courthouse.
Yeah.
So that doorway there is in that room to our left. That will be part of our 250th. That doorway is right in that room,
Yeah.
and that'll be part of our 250th
Yeah.
celebration that'll open on July the 3rd.
Yeah. John is pointing out that, this doorway here is part of an exhibit Revolutionary War, original doorway. Yeah. You can walk through, I'm not sure how to describe it.
It's against the wall.
It's against the
Leave
wall.
flashlights on.
You can't walk through it. You can walk up to it. You can pretend that you're like all these founders that were here. And yeah, thanks, John. Yes.
Yeah. Why were they here such a short time in York?
Well, they were in Lancaster for one day. It was 9 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was not, basically they, British chased them out, and then British left Philadelphia 9 months later and went back to New York. They said, oh, we're not gonna stay here in New York any longer than we have to, we're gonna go back to Philadelphia. Where they went back to a pretty badly damaged town. So they were here for 9 months, yeah. They were in Lancaster for a day because there was no room at the inn. The story is that the state government was there, and so this courthouse was empty. They could go across this Susquehanna and have that buffer in place. We'll talk about that in a second. And yeah, good questions, folks. Really appreciate these. There's also the story about the bells here, and this is the bell tower. And you might be wondering, I know John Guttrell is wondering, how do you get that picture? Because nothing up that high at that time anyway. And they got into, the photographer, Daily Record photographer, got into a cherry picker and got up here. You've got Tom Gibson up there in the tower of the courthouse. And that bell tower, or the one in the original courthouse, there was a bell ringer by the name of Martin Bernice who was served as a bell ringer for Congress each day, and he received that much ringing the bell in May 1778. This was the courthouse here, another one of the successor courthouse. This courthouse was knocked down in Center Square. They built this one, and and this is something Tom Schaefer wrote this in 1988. He was a historian here and did some really good Civil War work. I loved what he did here. He wrote this in a newspaper story. When the courthouse bell clamored on Sunday afternoon, this courthouse here, the workers weren't being called to worship. They were, however, being drawn to a reckoning of a different sort. That's where Drew Berlin came in and said we can get $100,000 and all this stuff in the community. Yeah.
$9, was that $9 a day, $9 for?
It was for the, yeah, for May, yeah.
And $9 big.
Yeah. I wanted to point out that I went too fast through this one. I think you all know that these columns here were recycled here onto this building. So when you see these, you're actually seeing they were able to salvage these, knock down the building, and then they kind of did this adaptive reuse of the columns. So maybe that will have a different meaning to you when you look at those. Those are 1839 columns. Okay, so Paul Revere's legacy here in New York County. We know Paul Revere wrote said two arms of British are coming, and he warned people at Lexington and Concord that the British were coming their way in 1775. And that fighting led to the siege of Boston, which brought the York County Rifle Unit to Boston, that 400 miles in 24 days. And then James Smith delivered the Declaration of Independence. He kind of did the Paul Revere Act, came from Philadelphia and delivered the Declaration of Independence on July 6th or somewhere in that time frame. And so he acted like a modern day or Paul Revere of a year later. So this is showing James Smith delivering the Declaration of Independence here. And so we had our own version of this. Paul Revere, a Paul Revere kinsman, piloted a train towards danger in Baltimore under Daniel Webster's kinsman's command. In Glen Rock, Daniel Webster said, this train's not moving fast enough. I think we have an engineer who's a rebel sympathizer. So he got Paul Revere's kinsman to pilot the train on into Baltimore. The York Rifles moved towards Cambridge to guard railroad after Sumter. We talked about that. And then this is just a kind of an interesting thing, at least to me. York County's A.B. Parker rode towards the enemy to work out a preliminary surrender agreement. We talked about that. I think you all know about that he unauthorized went out and surrendered the town to John B. Court, the Confederate general. And then this other group went out later on and included David Small and ratified that. And so he rode toward and returned to York with a different warning of preparation, surrender to the enemy. So we had Paul Revere on the one hand saying, the American Revolution saying, two arms, the British are coming, or allegedly said that. We have A.B. Parker saying, hey, the Confederates are coming, we need to surrender. Two different approaches in the face of the enemy, right? Just thought I'd point that out.
Paul
We'll talk
Revere
about that a
wasn't
little
from York,
bit
was he?
What's that, please?
Paul Revere, he wasn't from York, was he?
No. I'm just saying, I made two connections with him.
All right, I didn't think he was, but I wasn't
No.
sure.
It's because of him that our unit went up there because of his warning, because of the fighting in Lexington and Concord, that our unit, York County Rifle Unit went up to Boston. And with the siege of Boston. And then James Smith was acting like a Paul Revere and bringing the Declaration of Independence to York County. So, there's a little bit of metaphor there, but, yes.
On the other slide, you had the number 2, where you had York rifles. Wouldn't it have been the 87th by then? During the Civil War,
They later became the 87. At first, they were just a rifle company.
Yeah, in the beginning, but by the
Yeah.
time the Civil War came along, they were 87.
I think early on, and Scott, correct me, but I think,
September.
Yeah.
1861, they were.
yeah, so this was the kind of the local home guard. John, go ahead.
They were originally the Thomas Scott Regiment.
Right. Yeah,
Thomas Scott was a railroad man, and
Yeah.
he got Andrew Curtin to agree to allow him to raise the regiment to protect the railroad lines.
yeah, basically the York Rifles became known as York Rifles, a monument out in Salem Square and lumps the two. But they were formed, in some fashion after Sumter, and there's several months before they were folded into the 87th. I think that's a fairly consistent.
Scott, would have been Company A.
Yeah, they became a company of the 87th. Yeah. Yeah, there was some. Yes, right.
It was interesting looking at.
There's some reports that they're still ordered into some units that are in the military today, so. Okay, so here's the Susquehanna as a boundary, do a time check here. Okay, Susquehanna has a boundary in the two wars, the American Revolution, the Susquehanna, we see it right here. This is on a 1770 map, that's a big river. If you're looking at this map, if you're in Philadelphia or you're anywhere, you're seeing that map, that's very same map, you're looking at that river, it is a wide river. So it kept the British on its east bank. And but yet the people in York, the Continental Congress in York, were concerned that the British would splash across, come across. So they had the river sounded all the way from Harrisburg down to Chesapeake Bay, and they concluded that the Chesapeake would be the only way that the British would come in any amount of force. That all the fords and the ferries weren't good enough that they could bring a fighting unit across the river and so on. So there's a case of where it was really a barrier. British in Philadelphia wouldn't even consider going across there. And then the Civil War kept the Confederates on its west bank. It's interesting, extensive entrenchments that we see taking place here. So the Confederate assault on the bridge, the bridge was mined, and there was guns on the east bank. And I asked the question, what if the resistance had come westward? What if there had been roadblocks and so forth put up as the Confederates were coming across, and to slow the Confederates down? I guess we can talk about that in the question, Tom. We're running short on time here. But you think about that, if the Confederates would have been delayed, maybe Gordon wouldn't have got there Sunday night, he got there on Monday. By that time, they were being recalled to Gettysburg. So it might have been a different scenario. We can talk about that a little bit later if you want. But, before the bridge burning, before the call of Gettysburg, Confederates aimed a roundabout march to join forces in Carlisle on the west shore for assault on Harrisburg, and then they were called to Gettysburg. So you can see in both cases, the river played a role in both wars. This is an idea I'm playing with here, and there's probably a lot of metaphor here, but in colonial America, the way that historians talk about the frontier is it's an area of land that is being challenged by, or it happens to be being challenged in one way or another. So we have in York County, colonial York County, we had Crescent's War here, and we had a Native American raid on the Jefferson homestead in the French and Indian War. So this shows that raid by the Indians. And so we very much were a frontier here. And in some ways, it was interesting that the British came here, and in some ways, they kind of invaded York, or the Continental Congress invaded York County, but we were the furthest away of any of the capitals of the 9 capitals that the Continental Congress met in over the course of the war. So we were definitely on the frontier here for a lot of our early existence. And then during the Civil War, the Confederate incursion of York County brought the rebel army in the easternmost territory raided in the Pennsylvania campaign. So in some ways, York County in the Civil War would have acted as a frontier. And it's interesting, the earliest raid was led by pioneers, right? That's this unit right here that would lead the columns. They would clear road obstructions and things like that. You know, so it's just it's interesting that in some ways this was a frontier for the Confederate Army marching through York County in 1863. And Scott Mingus tells a story. Jacob Miller stopped this Confederate incursion with a cigar, used a cigar as a weapon. This is a black man who had a cigar lit and presumably to mine the bridge, you know, and light the fuse on the bridge, and maybe later to light the bridge on fire. So we had one black guy, you know, who was a carpenter, I believe, who had a cigar, who was weaponizing that cigar to stop the Confederate advance. Yes, sir.
Was it a Red Lion cigar?
Yeah, we don't know, but Trooper Early surely didn't like any York County cigar.
That's not my question though.
Yeah.
On the Wrightsville Bridge, had it not burned down, what are historians saying about what might have happened? And is there a chance that Gettysburg might not have happened? The way we understand it, if the bridge had not been burned down.
Well, let Scott take a try at this, but what I think is that if it had not been burned, they would have gotten, the Confederates would have probably gotten across. They would have been fought vigorously by cannon and so forth on the other side. They wouldn't have had time to get up to Harrisburg, you know, through Middletown and so on, because they were called to countermarch the next day. So they wouldn't have had time to go up to Lincoln or Harrisburg and take the capital from the backside. Scott, anything?
Yeah, just one thing to add, Battle of Gettysburg would have happened with or without Wrightsville, but Trooper Orley's not at Gettysburg on July 1st.
That's
Because
true.
he's marching to Lancaster County, never gonna get, and keep in mind, he doesn't arrive until 2 o'clock on July 1st, anyway.
Right.
So therefore, if he's sitting in Marietta or Middletown, he's not in Gettysburg until July 2nd.
Right.
Therefore, there's no flank attack on the 11th Corps on July 1st, there's no collapse of the 11th Corps on July 1st. Who knows?
But you'll add other corps, but you know, to take care of that or other divisions. So yeah, that's a good question, you know, but if they would have gotten across, they wouldn't have gotten up there.
Scott, could they have gone to Philadelphia?
I mean,
They wouldn't have had enough time.
It's harder from June 23rd, Captain Harrisburg.
So the Civil War was a conflict within a conflict. We're coming down to our last slides here. You know, the wars were messy. You can see all these different conflicts, American English subject versus the mother country, patriots versus royalists. They really were tremendously complex situations. And this American Civil War is the same thing. We had North versus South in battle, and then we had the North versus South in politics. And around here, we were Copperheads, which is some were peace Democrats that we talked about. We have York County soldiers versus the majority of home county citizens in 1864. The soldiers from York County were voted for Lincoln. We in York County voted for Lincoln's opponents in both elections. We had conscientious objectors and draft dodgers. So it was really complex. So I do this to show two examples of the complexity of the war. Here we have Henry Lawrence in the American Revolution. He was president of Congress. He was a really powerful figure. He was exchanged for Cornwallis later in the war. His health was broken when he was thrown in the Tower of London later in the war. But he, at the same time that he was in Congress here as president of Congress, he was dealing with his enslaved people back on his South Carolina plantations. So here we have a case, this is something he wrote, let Zuma follow him immediately to sell. If he once more elopes or commits any capital fault. So here he is managing with his manager down there, you know, his enslaved people down in South Carolina, even as he's fighting for American freedom up here. it's complex, isn't it? We could talk a lot about that. Then we have A.B. Parker, he was a young manufacturer here, he produced the military items for the Union Army. He became a major manufacturer, but he catalyzed the surrender of York, which was a major thing that affects us, I think, even today. It took us till about the year 2000 really to study the American Civil War. And so, and it's interesting, in his own autobiography, he talks about, look what the way he writes about John Brown's raid. He said he would, that if starting of an insurrection among the slaves of Virginia would not have taken place had he understood the slaves, for he would have known that the Negroes did not know the meaning of revolt, that they were in the main more interested in 3 meals a day than in political theory, and that if he had succeeded in stirring them to the point of frenzy, the only result would have been chaos. So he really couldn't steel himself against the enslavement that was taking place in the South. Is a typical peace Democrat position. And also, this is a lot of lost cause stuff in here. We know that a lot of enslaved people, they are more interested in 3 meals a day, or they wouldn't have been on the Underground Railroad. They would have stayed at home and had their 3 meals a day. It's just and this was written in 1922. So you have, these great people who are deeply flawed, as we all are. But these are in public position that can do things or not do things. And yes, sir.
Jim, on the politics of, I don't know, 1840 on through
Yeah.
the start of the Civil War. Was it Abe Lincoln was mentored by some name, a big shot politician that taught Abe Lincoln? Do you remember who that is?
I forget the name, but it was his law partner.
They both believed early on.
Yes.
The same 9 years, but well before
Right.
1950s, 55 anyway. When Lincoln was not voted in a few times, I think. And they were really good. They were going at freeing the slaves many years prior to. So do you know the politics of that? Because I noticed.
No, I don't. I know that Abe Lincoln didn't go into the war with the idea that we were going to free enslaved people. That didn't come.
He wanted it for several years with this mentor.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But he didn't go for that until Emancipation Proclamation in 1863.
Yeah.
So
Well, he pushed that, but they failed in Congress to try to get freedom for, and again, the mentor, whoever this mystery guy. That was that's what I had. I went to see
I haven't heard that. I don't think that Abe Lincoln was he went in with to office with that idea that he was going to abolish slavery. That just wasn't on his agenda. And then he evolved. His position was an evolving position, and he finally decided that by having the Emancipation Proclamation, it gave a moral reason for the war. Why were they fighting the war? Well, we're going to, it is evolving. We're going to free enslaved people. This is just a very interesting thing. We're kind of moving really quickly here, and this came from Dennis Brandt's book on the April 7th. Here we have the Sun Valley Soldier. I'll just read this because this shows the conflicts of York Countyans at that time. I call myself a Democrat, and I believe that the Democratic Party is right in the main question on national affairs. That was the predominant view in York County. This was we didn't want the war. We were peace Democrats here. As Lincoln represented a division of that. I said that the North would commence this warfare, that I would stand by the South, but if the South would fire upon Sumter and seek the destruction of our republic by making war upon it, I would be against the South and say, say blow them up, blow them to H. He didn't complete that, I guess. So so it goes to show the complexities. He's against the war, but he would go to war if they struck first. But you can see that he wasn't anti-slavery. If anything, he was for the Democratic position, which would have left slavery in place. George Niesner, the Moravian pastor in town, how many prayers and tears will now be brought before the Lord by parents for their children? So some of his congregation, a pacifist congregation, were leaving to war. And so he was just praying for him. I think we're going to go ahead and just move through that one. We'll basically, what happened here in York County was that York County was for the Constitution, versus the Declaration. We are for the Constitution because the Constitution allowed for slavery. Remember the 3/5 clause in the Constitution allowed for slavery. So our motto here was the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is, and the Negroes where they are. You know, that was the mantra in York County in those days, a peace Democrat, a Copperhead position here. So, you know, the Constitution as it is, allowing slavery in place. So if we've had our way here in York County, there'd still be slavery, you know. So whenever, and Abe Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was decidedly a Declaration of Independence oriented. 7 years ago was pointing to the Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal. So in New York County, we took the position that the Constitution was preeminent over the Declaration of Independence. And so whenever Lincoln gave his speech in Gettysburg, we had, you know, here was in Mr. Small's paper, New York Gazette, Mr. Lincoln made a joke or two. We ran a news story that said Mr. Lincoln made a joke or two. And then it ran another newspaper account with the groans of the wounded still resounding in the air, the core of the slain still unburdened, the bereaved still clad in emblems of mourning, and their tears still flowing. These men meet to laugh and joke at election year. That's the best we could do. See, it's like Fox News today reporting on something that Democrats do, or the CNN reporting on the Republicans. It's just, you know, you're not going to get a true story. And so the paper was against Lincoln, and so this is what you get. So we've had that problem for a long time. So the concluding here, and I've done this in a lot of presentations, and I think it's really important to understand this. Where did this courthouse sit? This is the original courthouse. Where did it sit? Where did it stand? Yeah, Center Square. George is High Street and George Street. And that's where it sat. Okay, where did this flagpole stand? Same place. So someone tell the story. We have this in the same place. What's happening? 85 years, 86 years apart. What does this represent? The York County Courthouse, our confederations were adopted there. The Union helped bring them in lines with France. You know, so our Constitution was adopted right in the center square here. The Confederation took place. And right in that same square where the flag was raised, there was a deconfederation that took place, right? The flag represented America coming apart. You know, here on our soil, in the same place where Confederation came together, the Confederation was coming apart. We had Confederate Army right in our square taking down the flag that represented Confederation and carrying it away. See that in one spot. You think we don't have a rich history here in York County? You know, you're just talking about a foot square, you know, there. And interestingly, Richard Henry Lee initially called for, you know, the Arts and Federation, as we've talked about, and his kinsman, Robert E. Lee, was the top commander of the folks that took down the flag. You had one family that brought our Confederation as a country and then caused our deconfederation, our country coming apart. You know, all these interesting Civil War, Revolutionary War connections, right? Hope you still feel they're interesting. So, wars change your account. You know, this is really important. Paul Jatrick talks a lot about this. Paul Jatrick at York College wrote his dissertation. He said basically we were a German peasant village before the American Revolution. We bartered things. After the Revolution, we were in the American mainstream. The Revolution had really changed York County, and we were in the American mainstream. And then we were ready for the business class to start. Business class being William C. Goodrich, for example. Business class being George Small and then P.A.N.S. Small. So the American Revolution got us into the American mainstream, took us out of being a village, a German peasant village, which, you know, Paul Jatrick calls that. It's I think it's a little severe. But, you know, and then in the Civil War, Jim Lloyd writes that our men went off to war and they were no longer Germans who get along speaking Dutch. They were Americans and their lives could depend on the ability to communicate in English. So it changed. Our guys went away. Was it 5,200 of them went away, and they went to, and they came back, and they were different. And so that got us ready for, you know, the Industrial Revolution in 1880 with S. Morgan Smith, who was the Civil War chaplain, P.H. Gladfelder, and A.B. Parker, and then Samuel and Isabel Small. The Industrial Revolution, all those things, all those entities took off after the Civil War. So the wars did great change, and we could say the same thing about World War II, right? Then we had York County Shopping Center, we had Haynes Acres, we had Caterpillar. These wars are disruptors. They make a difference. They're terribly, terribly painful, aren't they? But these wars do move us ahead in some ways as a community. We have an outstanding opportunity to experience a lot of the things we're talking about here tonight, because the Mifflin House project is going up in Helen Township, and this is the Mifflin House here. And here's some of Scott Mingus's work to show the Confederate positions around Wrightsville in 1863. So the Mifflin House has a Revolutionary War past. Jonathan Mifflin was a Revolutionary War officer. They had an Underground Railroad past, and then it has a probable Civil War past. It's possible that gun emplacements were there, or at least trenches. These trenches might have extended out into there. So we have three wars, all three of these major moments wrapped up in this Helen Township property, which is being opened, and you can go out there and visit it, and almost every weekend. They're showing Glory out there this weekend, maybe. So Scott, anything else to say about the Civil War aspect of the Mifflin Farm? Because you're the one that kind of brought it to the public attention, the underground past and the Civil War past.
Just one quick comment, it's one of the very few sites that we know it's an Underground Railroad site, but it's also a Civil War battlefield. Gettysburg, one of the others, but aren't they?
Yeah. So it's quite a place that's under development. So it's kind of interesting the way wars work, and life does go on in a way. But I talked about them strutting back to Philadelphia, the Continental Congress. Before they left, they would have tea out on the island with women in town, and they would have tea time. They called the islands and the Cadors Patmos. This is out near Kings Mill, out near York College today, out near Smurfit Stone, out in there were islands at one time. They dredged them and so forth over the course of time. But so we were able to, after that hard winter, we were able to enjoy ourselves. And then right before the Civil War, right after the Civil War ending, so they planned this before the Civil War, we had Hannibal, the war elephant, came across the Susquehanna on a barge of some type, came here, there's a circus in town, and he went further west in Bedford County, I believe it was. He ate some mountain laurel, some type of poisonous plant, and died. He was this is one of his last performances here in York County. But but there is, in time of war is tough, war is terrible, but there's diversions. Life goes on in a way after the war, and there's two examples of that. Yeah, just Google Hannibal the war elf, and you'll see he has quite a history. So here's where we started, and I think if you can see, there's a lot between the two wars, a lot of connections here, and glad to take any questions or comments. We answered them all as we went. Okay.
Actually, a lot of the photographs from the original York rifle with him. You guys, either you or Scott, you know if this descendant is still in the York area?
That's George Kane.
Okay,
George A. Kane, yeah. He's still in town, and a lot of people know him, yeah. I might say, when did you start meeting at Borders? Was it 1997?
Yeah.
30-year anniversary coming up.
Next year.
Yeah, 30, so we're Roundtable 30 years next year. And as the story goes, as we tell it, that you're instrumental in getting us talking about the Civil War. That was around the year 2000. Well, a lot of things came together. That's another topic for the thing. Yes. Tom Schaefer, right? Right, right. That's right. Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This, the way I tell the story, and I think it's true, that the surrender really put a damper on our Civil War conversations through much of the 20th century. And then later because who wants to talk about a surrender? Hanover had something to talk about, Wrightsville has something, in York area, we didn't, and so we didn't, so it really took, late in the century, 2000, after that, for us to start a good conversation. The Civil War Roundtable was part of that conversation. And now here we are tonight, a full house, talking about this stuff. And we're talking about tough stuff, right? We're talking about very difficult things. A.B. Farquhar, who some people think is a hero, it's a mixed bag, I think. So we're able to talk about these things and explore these things. Other questions? Thanks, Kate. Other questions or comments? Go ahead. Yes, please.
Before the surrender, was York damaged?
Yeah, that's all. What you're getting at is, York was not damaged. And so a lot of people say the surrender was justified because it ensured that York would not be damaged. And so therefore it was justified. So it's kind of a pragmatic thing. But in the process, what we did when you surrender a town, not only did we surrender the town, but we went out and met the enemy 10 miles from town, and so who does that? Civilians, unauthorized civilians in a theater of war go out and meet the enemy and say, come on in. And that's exactly what happened. And so, but some people have rounded those corners and say, well, the town was saved. I submit if the town was burned or partially burned, we still would have had a great industrial revolution. That we had these resources, these great people here in town that would rebuild the town. And it wouldn't have been easy, but in hindsight, they wouldn't have burned the town anyway. They were under orders not to burn the town. But some people would ask, well, what could they have done? And Hanover would be a good example. What they could have done is they could have just stood in the square and with their arms folded and said, we're undefended, we aren't going to surrender, but we don't have anybody to fight you, but we're not going to surrender. And if we had done that, we would see history a little differently today. I think York area would see our Civil War history a little differently. Today, it's just this surrender stuff that kind of throws us. And then one of the things that Scott's done, and I've tried to do, is in many of our presentations, we try to talk about all the other stuff that the York area did. For example, the Children's Home of York was established. So we did a lot of stuff. We hosted a military hospital here. We hosted a military camp here until Camp Curtin came into play. So we had a great story to tell. We had a great story to tell in the 20th century. We just didn't tell it because we're hung up on the surrender thing, and so now we're kind of past that, and we have Scott doing his handiwork, and we understand the Civil War a lot better now. That's more than you asked for, but you got me going. Yeah. Kate?
I just wanted to mention, and I talked about this earlier, about your articles that you're writing in the New York Daily Record and the New York Dispatch for 20 years.
York Daily Record, yeah.
20 American stories on the 250th anniversary about your county's connection with the American Revolution. So you started last Friday, and that was with Crispus Attucks in the Buckminster. And then you had the next one, the Sunday, you had a big one Sunday.
Right.
Revolutionary War changed your county, some changed your county. Your coalition joined the American Revolution, was your patriotic, and today was Jefferson Sunday. So we'll continue until you've gotten.
Yeah, until we go through all 20. I wrote 20 stories, and they're real short stories to tell the story. Some of the stuff we talked about tonight. So they're online too on YCWRT.com. So you can get it in the paper and get them online. We're on about number 5 of 20. So you still can catch up.
You mentioned the military camp. Where was the military camp?
Yeah, that was early in the war. The Green recruits came here because we were on a railhead, a good location. It was at York Fairgrounds, And York Fairgrounds in those days was at King and Queen Street, you know where the Bond is, Bond Sanitary Products, right across from there. And there's a little road leading off of King Street called Fair Alley. So if you want to go back, that's the old entrance to the camp. So you can walk back that road. It's now built up.
What alley?
Fair Alley, called Fair Alley. And so that was where the fair was until 1888, and then they moved out to where they are today, York Expo Center. Yeah, yeah. There's pictures I didn't show them, but there's Lewis Miller drawings and stuff. It was a big camp. Fairgrounds was built. Yeah,
And what was Smalls and Farquhar's reputation after the war?
Yeah, the Smalls really, they were Republican and they didn't really, so they were on the right side and at least PA and S Small. Now now, if you're asking David Small continued, who was the Democratic chief Burgess, he continued to run the paper and it didn't affect him. A.B. Parker, whenever he came back into town, according to his own admission, he was called the guy that sold out York. And, but he was able to recover over the course of time and he became a leading and respected figure in town. So memories were short on that, but you can see in his autobiography, you know, kind of that was his thinking, you know, so a community leader who thinks like that and you know, really thinks about the lost cause, how things were really not that bad in the South for enslaved people. And, you know, that was his thought towards the end of his life. And something I didn't point out was in his autobiography, he talks about 3 different encounters with the Confederates or with the city fathers, the community of safety. And all 3 times he talks about the fact he had a factory here. You know, one of them know he has a factory. So he was conflicted as he had businesses in town. So here he was surrendering the town to save his business. But maybe, and one time he did mention the people of New York. One of those 3 times he mentioned business and people. So, you know, in his own words, he talks about the fact that he was trying to, you know, get business here. So he's interested in what they were going to do to his town. So, you know, he's young, he grew up and he was respected, but he still held these views up into the 1920s, only 100 years from ago. Yes.
So was it the town's money that he gave up? Because I mean, if they did that today, oh my God, the taxes are going up and all that stuff, but.
They passed a hat. They
Okay,
basically had, Scott will smile at this, they basically assigned block captains or people to go around with a hat and throw your money in. They raised $28,600.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, out of 100,000. Interestingly, Scott and I found that Farquhar didn't put anything in the hat. Now, he might have lived in Spring Garden Township. You know, he might have had an exception. You know, you can think about what you want, but we didn't pay. At least he's on any of the lists because our list of who threw money in the hat, his name wasn't on the list. Other questions or comments? Yes.
So is he the guy that Farquhar Park's named after?
Yes. Parker Park.
Oh, change the name of that thing, ain't?
Well, it's been suggested.
It's called Kennedy Park.
Yeah, there's a book out recently on Parker Estates, and it talks about A.B. Parker and the Parker family. And I don't know, you can. What I know is that it changed the way York sees the Civil War. It changed it for a long period of time, and I always will say, and I always will believe this, that when you don't talk about the Civil War for much of the 20th century, what also aren't you talking about? You're not talking about race. You're not talking about enslavement. You're not talking about the Underground Railroad. You know, and if you look back, there's between 1906 when Prowl wrote and you know the late 1980s, 1990s, there's very little written. There's one master's thesis written in 1964, but there's very little literature written on the Civil War, and so there's very little discussion. Some people will say, well, when you know. When I was a Boy Scout, I went down in 1937 or whatever, and I helped with the veterans, and we talked about. But I think that what happens, we talked about Gettysburg. We didn't talk about the Confederate invasion. We didn't talk about what happened in the New York area. We talked about Gettysburg. Yes,
Question and a comment, question, your 4,000.
Yeah.
Men that served from the county.
yes.
That include the militia and the regular army?
Yeah, it's fuzzy. It's fuzzy what that is. The short answer is yes. You know, there's Dennis Ness is doing some really good work on, just like Dennis Brand is doing, really good work on the militia and the home guards and those units that were here before. And so he's written. You can go online and see some of the things he's written. But I think it's no one from the history centers here. That's their number that we arrived at. But I think it's both. It's both regular army and militia units.
Because my fourth great grandfather and his brother were guards at Camp Security, that's
Yeah, there's work being done on that, on camp security and the guards, and more will come out about that. That's something that, because we have a lot of folks here that are related to guards at camp security. And so there's a real effort to try to understand, you know, who those guards were and try to identify those guards.
Then my comment was, I was in Winchester, Virginia over the weekend for the 163rd anniversary of Second Winchester. And the Senate Valley Battlefield Trust recently acquired the Carter Farm. And I got the opportunity to walk some of the fields where supposedly the 87th was captured, including my great grandfather.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Scott, do you have anything you've written about Winchester? Is there anything anything updates on that?
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously gonna be interpreting the land. We've got a parking lot now for the first time, so you can actually
Yeah,
drive in and.
that's where I was.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's in good shape.
Right. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Jim, back to the French for the Civil War. Did they, I don't know, I got dates in my head, scrambled.
You mean Civil War or American Revolution?
Well, both. Now I'm going to the Civil War.
Okay.
Didn't France back the Confederacy to a point where finally the slavery broke them off to back the Union cause and the Republic cause? And it was that, did that happen, I guess? And when
Yeah.
did it happen? And how much of an influence was France to help the war?
Just real quickly. In a book I wrote called If We're Striking for Pennsylvania, I studied the French and British attitudes in 1863 towards the Confederacy of the United States. By then, Napoleon III was still interested in somewhat supporting the Confederacy, but he was kind of waiting to see what was happening with the Gettysburg campaign. And if you look at it, before the Battle of Gettysburg, Napoleon III was still studying. After the Battle of Gettysburg, they don't discuss it anymore.
Yeah, it would have been a tall order for French for countries in Europe to support a slaveholding nation. And Britain, certainly they were leaders in manumission, and then they were going to go back and support the South. So it'd been a tall order. And the French discussion I don't know a lot about that, but I do know that America, the South was pretty peculiar, very unusual to still be a slaveholding nation, as it were. And that wasn't something of respect in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I just add one more quick personal note. In 1865, after the Confederacy collapsed, Napoleon III still had a French army sitting in Mexico, and my great grandfather and 75,000 other soldiers were shipped to Texas. That's where Juneteenth came from. The original holidays, they stayed in Texas for the next 2 years to make sure the French didn't come across the border. So they were also enforcing Juneteenth, but the real reason Phil Sheridan, Fort Granger were in Texas, and my great grandfather were to keep the French at bay. So there was always this concern that France was gonna invade.
Great, thanks. Anything else? We're about at the 30 mark. So thank you all very much. Really appreciate your question.
There's a lot of stories about it.